Hey guys, this is miicrow here. I wanted to make a quick guide for people that are just hitting 65 or they're in that kind of endgame grind from low gear score to getting to max characters, and kind of go over some helpful tips for this, as well as kind of a high level quick way to progress your character. So this is intended to talk about the main power spikes when it comes to New World, and these seem to be more defined than they were in the past, and I wanted to go into that today. So the first thing that you kind of come to when you hit 65 is you basically just graduated from like the pre-early game phase of New World, and then you enter into early game. Your next goal is basically to hit 600, go from like roughly 600 to 650 gear score, and there's a few ways to do this. This is outlined in New World on this kind of far left side of the activity finder for the most part. So expeditions are a really good way to get this, as well as soul trials. The other major way to increase your gear score quickly is going on chest runs, which you can see by just paying attention to area chat, where you see people say like XCK, X Tempest is not really the same thing, but like where you see like XCK, or if you see X World Tour, those are people trying to get on a chest run. Chest runs can give you up to 700 gear score. It feels like early on tends to be a little bit lower, but it's a really easy and efficient way to progress your character quickly, as well as grow your economy. So it's something that's just generally beneficial to do, and that's like something you should be looking to do in the really early game. The other main thing to take advantage of is this activities, the new activity finder menu. If you go to expeditions, all this gear can drop up to 650 gear score. And the other noteworthy thing too is if you queue a random one, you get a bonus to the amount of gold you get per day. I think it's like 500 gold if you queue as a tank, or if you queue as a healer, you also get a bonus cash that's equal to like 500 gold. So both of those are really easy ways to get gear. There's also soul trials, which are a newer thing that New World has added. I'd argue the gear from these is generally not super impactful. The main thing to try to get from these is the artifact called Power Stone, which will help you for a lot of classes. So if you're like any class that is like utility focused or even DPS focused in terms of PvE, Power Stone's a really good option. Really important offhand to have in terms of one of these in each mutated expedition that you run, as well as in raids. So it's just really powerful because this heavy burden effect applies while it's an offhand. Noteworthy, this doesn't seem to apply off of effects like attunement or like the new PvP perk called Thorny Reflection, but it is something that's super impactful if you could pick it up, and will help kind of carry your runs early on. So kind of moving on from the early game, I would call it, the 600 to 700 or 600 to 650 a gear score, we enter into the mid game. In the mid game of New World, you're looking to hit 700 gear score. You'll notice that you basically could just move over to the right here in terms of the PvE, and you want to start doing mutated expeditions. To do a mutated expedition, you need to do the precursor regular expedition, and then that will open up the mutated expeditions. Similar to the expedition, where you can get a gold reward, you can do a random queue on here, and you get 1,000 gold for each one that you do. It says 150, it's actually 1,000. The ones that you could actually RNG to are the ones that you've done the precursor for. So when I hit random here on the background, you can see how the Starstone Burrows is highlighted green, and you see Glacial Tarn is highlighted green. That's because I've done the precursors for that. Depths I've not done the precursor for, so if I hit random, I cannot queue into the depths. You could use this early on to kind of manipulate the system to give you guaranteed gold for the mutation that you want to do per week. So a lot of people wanted to do the Glacial Tarn this week, and if you hadn't done a Starstone or you hadn't done a Depths, then you could do a Glacial Tarn, and then that would allow you to get the specific gear that you're looking for, which also brings me to point 2, that some of these mutations have a gear score requirement that you really want to hit. If you're early on and you're just random queuing, I think you can only random queue up to an M2, so you're looking to get that gear up to 650 gear score generally before you start doing these queues. If you are below 650 gear score, this is the one spot in terms of PvE where that will negatively impact you. There is no hard gear score requirement for raids as far as I'm aware, and there's no gear score requirement from the open world. So you could run lower gear score items there and you're not as punished, but lower gear score items also come with the downside that they will provide less protection or less damage. So it's generally beneficial to run higher gear score items with some small exceptions in terms of PvP, but it is usually want to be hitting these thresholds before you go for these random queues. So the other thing that you're looking for is pieces of gear that are very, very powerful that can drop from these are unique, upgradable kind of artifacts. You could see these if you go to New World Database. There's like a whole section of these upgradable gear pieces, and if you go to the popular tab, you'll often see them appear on the front page. So stuff like Frigid Dawn is relatively popular. It could drop below 700 gear score, but you have an upgrade recipe to upgrade this 700 gear score, and it's still some of the best gear in the game. So just be aware that there's a lot of named weapons that will drop really good items. So depending on what class you're looking for, it might be worth going to the New World Database, kind of playing around with what you're looking for. So for example, if I was a blunderbuss player and I was looking to get a blunderbuss that could be upgraded to 700 gear score, and you knew what perks you wanted, like if I wanted keenly empowered, for example, my blunderbuss, you could put in keenly empowered. Then you can see types of blunderbuss that have keenly empowered on them. So like Deep River as a blunderbuss is considered to be a best in slot blunderbuss, or BIS as a lot of New World community likes to call it, and that has keenly empowered and enchanted on there, and that's a easily farmable piece that you can then upgrade to get what would be typically considered to be an endgame capable item. With the new addition of 725 gear score, the weapons typically are not preferred in endgame because they have a like roughly 3 to 10% DPS stiff, but they are still plenty capable in terms of their outgoing damage. So that's something that's really, really noteworthy and will kind of help speed you along in that mid game if you get some of these artifacts or things that you want. So like yesterday, for example, a lot of people that were paying attention to stream saw me farming a set called Wood Grain. Wood Grain is a particularly good set for tank players, and it's very easy to acquire, and you can just upgrade this, and then you have really good endgame gear. The other noteworthy thing I'd say if you're trying to get to 650 to 700 gear score is try to do your factions related quests and your faction missions. So if you're, depending on what faction you are in, you'll see like a glowing thing above someone's head in whatever town you're in, and these areas provide the faction quests. There's also a unique area for Syndicate, which I believe is this cave over here. They're for Marauders. It's up here on the left where I'm putting my marker, and then for Covenant, it is down here on the bottom right, all located in Everfall. And these are the main area where you'll have your quest to upgrade the factions. They are a lot easier than they used to be, and these unlock a lot of things that are really useful, particularly for endgame. Gypsum orbs are really useful. Writs of Adventure are used to upgrade heartrunes, which is also something you should be looking at when you're trying to get from 650 to 700 gear score. And then you also have access to relatively easy ways to kind of boost your end game. So when I'm talking about upgrading gear in terms of those named weapons, you can get chromatic seals from here, and that will help upgrade the gear. So that's something that's also noteworthy as well. There's also things like the logging mastering or harvesting mastering or mining mastering. All of this can give a ton of XP and is generally worth buying if you're trying to get these things leveled up. It will save you a lot of time. It's something I generally recommend. The faction gear is also just strictly best in slot gear for PvE, but it is relatively expensive. Some people might think it's worth getting, but like refreshing, enchanted ward, and health are all very, very good in terms of PvE, in terms of perks. For PvP, this is also very fine gear, and if you take in consideration things like OPR or 3v3, which will automatically upscale your gear score, you could actually use this gear in PvP as well. So really easy way to acquire good gear is through the factions. That's something I'd recommend if you're entering into that mid-game phase where you're kind of 650 to 700 gear score. Now, the heartrunes are a whole separate thing. They are located in Brimstone Stands. You basically just need to continue doing the story to the part where you defeat the Goat King, or you get to the area where the Goat King is. I believe it's over here. And then once you get to this area, you'll see a quest appear that is located up here in the top right of Brimstone Stands. This will unlock your first heart rune and your heart gem. These heart runes can be obtained from various dungeons and have very, very powerful effects. The most popular one I'd say right now is one called Stoneform. Stoneform is a heart rune that is gathered from the Lazarus expedition. And what it allows you to do is it just gives you passive immunity to CC effects. It breaks you out of CC effects and gives you a little bit of Fortify, as well as for one of the most popular upgrades, it will actually heal you. So this is a really good heart rune for just keeping yourself alive in a lot of various forms of content. That being said, there's plenty of other heart runes. I think I've made videos in terms of a tier list of these relatively recently. If not, we can kind of do one again if people are curious, but they are very, very powerful and something you definitely should pick up early on in a game. The other good way to get the 700 gear score is if you are doing those chest runs that we talked about. Sometimes if you see people talk about Merc Guard, there are portals up here. If you complete the portals, these will drop like a chest basically that you can open, and if you open up that chest, it can drop 700 gear score items as well. This also brings us to our next point where we want to talk about 700 gear score, and this is in terms of artifacts. Artifacts are very, very powerful, but you can only have one artifact from armor, which considers everything on this left side of the tree. You can have one for weapon, which is this top right side, and you can have one for jewelry. Typically, armor artifacts are very limited in terms of their viability. There's a lot of various DPS artifacts in terms of the weapon slots that are used. And then jewelry is also relatively diverse. If you are looking at armor artifacts, there are a few that you should pay attention to. Attuned leather pants is a relatively good artifact for DPS builds that are just trying to do PvE. There is also an artifact for light players called Featherweight. That one is very, very popular to gather as well. And there's another final one, which I don't have in my inventory right now, called Tumbler Feet Wraps. Tumbler Feet Wraps is a really, really good artifact for medium and heavy players. This will kind of allow you, it gives you a fortify, it gives you a DPS boost, and it heals you. So it's just like, it kind of does everything, which is why it's so super popular and a lot of medium players run it. There's not many other artifacts in medium that are used right now. Attuned leather pants is somewhat used in PvE. There's the Azoth conductors, which is a new artifact from one of the raids it's used, but it's not super achievable for the majority of the player base right now. And I'd say that's it in terms of the armor artifacts that are noteworthy. If you're in heavy, Void Darkplate's also quite nice. Weapons are very, very diverse. I kind of defer to a separate video for that. And jewelry is also relatively diverse. Elemental Band seems like it's a big winner recently, because even though it says that it doesn't trigger off damage over time or attunements, it actually does. So a lot of builds in terms of the PvP and PvE meta right now are taking advantage of this effect and are trying to get as many different elemental effects going on to maximize the empower gain from this, which will thereby increase your damage. So that's something that's noteworthy in terms of the artifacts and what you should be looking for. Once you get 3 artifacts that you're relatively happy with for your build, I'd recommend trying out a few other builds before you kind of proceed to try to completely max out your items. To be honest, like we talk about 3 perk best in slot or BIS items in New World a lot, you really only need 2 perks to be really effective with your gear. The third one, we would like to call often 2.5 perk BIS, where it's like you get 2 perks that are really good and you get a third one that's like, it's good enough, and you don't really worry about the gear piece too much. One example of that 2.5 perk BIS would be this Rusher Plate Gauntlets that I have here. It has Health, Elemental Aversion, which I consider to be amazing for the build I play, and then it has Strike Conditioning, which Strike Conditioning isn't bad, but it's not like the perfect perk that I want. But this didn't cost me anything, and if I wanted a 3 perk BIS piece, it might cost me 50k, and I only have like 60k right now. So it's just generally not worth stressing over like the fine details for getting super BIS artifacts in terms of your, or super BIS gear in terms of your armor. For weapons, I would generally recommend getting a 3 perk best in slot thing for your main hand. Your offhand isn't as important. Jewelry, it's also not very important in terms of like what gear you get, but there's some specific pieces that are worth farming. One that's noteworthy is called Teardrop. This is one that's used for a lot of heavy builds to try to increase the amount of cooldowns that you could use. And another really common one that's used is called Deckhand. Deckhand's actually one that you get from doing the main story quest, and if you salvaged it, you can't get it anymore. But it basically has a bugged perk on here that will give you a 25% or 24% in power if people are hitting you or if mobs are hitting you. And this applies to both weapons, and it's a small sacrifice in terms of the amount of stats that you get for a very large DPS game. So it's very, very common to see this artifact used in PvP. In PvE, it's a little bit less common because a lot of PvE builds focus on not necessarily taking a lot of damage, or more glass cannon oriented, so it can work a little bit less effectively with those builds, but it's a very good earring piece to pick up. Now moving on to the end game here, there's only currently 3 ways, well I'd argue 2. There's currently 2 ways to get end game level gear. At one point there was AGS plan to have a weekly outpost rush in 3v3 oriented drop that can give you up to 725. It seems like that was removed from my understanding. So currently the only ways to really get the gear are from raids. There's the Hive of Gorgons raid, which you can see by going to this raid tab here. This will drop up to 725 gear score. It is something that a lot of pugs or pickup groups are struggling to complete right now, but a lot of experienced players have already completed. I'd say the main issue with this raid is it's a very high knowledge gap. I would recommend watching some build guides before you go into it, but if you understand the basic fundamentals, it is mechanically not a super difficult raid. The other one that exists is the Sandworm. The Sandworm is called, also known as the Trial of the Devourer, has a reward that both is daily and weekly, versus the other raid, the newer one's only a weekly reward, so people tend to do the Sandworm a little bit more. The main benefit about the Sandworm is it drops what we like to call illegal best in slot gear pieces. By that I mean this light helmet is stronger than some artifacts right now because of the savior perk it has on there, because that's normally a weapon perk, and it turns out if you could heal 20% more passively, that it is incredibly broken, and it's something that you can only get from the Sandworm raid. So it's very, very popular for a lot of endgame kind of quote-unquote sweaty players, or players that are super, super try-hard to try to get this, and people are trying to complete this every single day. The daily chest has a chance of dropping the named items, or it will drop regular items. So people have been doing this raid very consistently, and it's a good way to get 725 gear score gear. The other way that I'd argue is a lot more achievable players is going to the PvP island. The PvP island consists of everything on this kind of left hand of the map. There are a few ways to kind of get gear from here that will skyrocket your progression, and I'll travel there to kind of show you guys this. Also, one trick for this PvP island is if you go to New World Buddy, you could actually see the location of all the chests on the island, which will give you gear, or you could just do chest runs in the area and not even participate in the PvP zone. If you want to participate in the PvP zone, I'd recommend typing in Cursed Chest and the New World Buddy, clicking like large or something like that. A map will pop up on the far right here. You can hit toggle full screen, zoom in a bit, and bam, we just have every single chest on the island. So you can just go around to those key locations for chests. It's noteworthy that this far area is a very big hotspot for PvP activity, but this middle area is like far less common. So like often I get the chests down here in this area because there's like 5 and it's a little bit out of the way, as well as like this kind of middle ground area, and I don't necessarily go to the high PvP area when I'm trying to gather stuff. This bottom right's also a spot that's not typically as contested and contains a lot of good drops. There's also an abundance of materials that you can gather from there. Generally really good if you're gathering. You just need to have a set that is able to live in a 1v1 or 2v1 situation, because there is teaming. So I just recommend something that's relatively tanky, like one of the tank builds that's relatively popular and you should be fine, or something like a healer build that can just out heal all the damage that's incoming. With the rewards, you can go to this Well of Fortune. The Well of Fortune has some artifacts that you can acquire, which are not really best in slot, but are decent artifacts, as well as gear. I would generally not recommend using any of your gold cursed coconuts on the gear from this area unless you are upgrading a specific weapon. So if I wanted to, say, upgrade this spear called Stop Poking Me, I could craft this spear, and then I can go upgrade this spear using a coconut, and then that will give me not the best spear possible to get in the game, but a very, very competitive one at a very, very low price point. In terms of time spent in New World. So it's like very, very good for that. The other noteworthy thing is this gold cursed epic crate could actually just give you 725 gear score, and it's like really, really cheap to get. Like that cost me like 105 doubloons, and I have a chance for 700 gear score, or 725 gear score. So it's just worth getting that every day. The gypsum orbs are nice, as well as some of the various kind of free food down there. See if I hit it today, but I probably won't. Okay, we hit 690, but like, bam, we got Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, / Conditioning. Like, that's a pretty good piece. And the other noteworthy thing is there is loot biasing for a lot of these chests, so it's like important to switch your Magnify to whatever stat. So previously it was on Dexterity. I got Dexterity gear. I'm wearing Heavy, so I got Heavy gear. If I switch to Con and I get a gear piece, you'll see that it's actually Constitution now. I could open one more. And 692, so we didn't get 725 this time, but we still got something that corresponded to the attribute in the gear that we're wearing. So we're wearing a flail, so we got a flail. So something that's kind of useful there, relatively cheap to acquire. Again, you don't have to do the PvP in this area to get this. You could also just do the chest runs located in the bottom right area. You see people all the time typing in XCK. We still see people doing it because people love to do the chest runs for gear in this area right now. So that's like, I'd say towards the end game is like when you start thinking about getting from 700 to 725. I'd say the real end game from New World isn't really the PvP side, it's more the crafting side right now, or you can call it like optimizing. So in terms of crafting, there's a lot of different options. Basically just go to this trade skill tab and everything on here can make you some form of a gold. I'd argue that the right side doesn't make as much gold. Fishing is possible to make gold. Music's technically possible to make gold, but isn't really that feasible in terms of endgame because it relies on players tipping you. But everything else on this list can make a gold to some capacity. If your main goal with one of these crafting things or refining is to hit the level cap. Once you hit the level cap, you start seeing this extra number go around. Every time you hit one of these markers for the extra number, you get a box, and then that gives you access to really good gear. So like one common trick is using jewel crafting. Craft a bunch of gems because gems are under jewel crafting now. You open up the boxes, and then those gems will give you prismatic ingots, which you could then sell on the market. So it's just like a small tip in terms of crafting, but it's very, very easy to kind of get there in terms of a refining aspect to a relatively good economy. I've seen a lot of people with a lot more gold than I have, but I have a decent amount right now, and that's what I've basically been doing. The other good way to boost your economy is doing these chest runs, because that can just give you free best-in-slot gear, or at least pre-700 best-in-slot gear that you could just sell to other players, and they tend to pay a premium for it. There is also refining. Refining, I'd argue, is a little bit less profitable right now, but it's basically using these trade skills down at the bottom. The main noteworthy thing for refining is you want to kind of capture the corresponding fort before you really do this if you want to make a big profit. So the Weber's Fen fort that we made a video on separately will give us a 10% refining yield boost, and that will help us kind of get more out of our economy. There is also market flipping, which is just doing trade post stuff, but tends to be a little bit more boring in my opinion. You can do crafting, but I'd argue crafting isn't really as profitable anymore because you can't craft 725 items. The only current way to craft 725 is using a 1 in 200 drop from the Gorgon raid schematic that can only drop once per week, and that can give you 725. And if you have that schematic, crafting is very, very profitable, but if you don't have it, it's not as profitable. So you see some people have gotten a schematic on my server, they're just spamming crafts, and then people are selling these crafts at a premium. So I can buy this 3 perk, a very good piece, but it will cost me 35k in order to get it, which is like half the gold I've acquired. So if you can get to the point where you have the schematic, you can make a ton of money. But if you don't have the schematic, I would not really bother with trying to focus on the crafting side of things. For all intents and purposes, this is more or less removed from a player-to-player selling perspective to favor a more traditional progression system. You can still do some things with it. Like I was able to craft myself this kite shield, which is really, really good. And there's some other kind of best in slot perks that you can get that you can craft, but it just generally isn't the most powerful thing. Other noteworthy thing in terms of a kind of an economy standpoint is making sure to do your dailies, as people like to call them. These include gypsum, which I don't believe there's a gypsum in CK, so I can't show you that one right now. The other big one that I think a lot of people miss out on is your faction bonuses. So if you go to an endgame area for faction, which would be like CK, it would be Elysian, I believe, would have a pretty good one. Brimstone has a pretty good one. Shadow Mountain has a pretty good one. And you do the quest. The first quest per day gives like a 10 times gold reward or something like that. So this is 10 times? It's a lot more. I forget exactly how much more it is. But it's basically if you do these daily quests, you get a ton of coins from them. So it's just generally worth picking these up. Like early on, and then if you're trying to like get into a raid later on, what I like to do is I like to lock the ones in for the raid, and I just keep re-rolling it until I get the one that I want. And then when I get all the ones I want, then I try to get a raid group together. We do the raid, I get a bunch of coins, other people get the gear that they want, and everyone's kind of happy. So that's like a good way to get it. The other one that is like relatively popular from a PvE perspective is you do your daily expeditions in terms of your random queues. Gives you that bonus cash. Again, recommend tank or healer because that gives you an additional gold incentive. Or you could do mutated ones, which will also give you a bonus cash, and that will help out a lot as well. So those are like kind of my 5 big kind of power spike tips in New World to kind of recap these. 600 to 650 gear score is when you're in that early game phase. You're basically looking at the left side of this PvE tree. The mid game is 650 to 700 gear score. This is like when you're looking to get heartrunes, or maybe even earlier on than that. You're looking to get name gear, you're looking to get faction gear. You're trying to get whatever gear is relatively accessible, but might not necessarily be called best in slot. And this gear is totally fine to use throughout the end game. And I think this is where about 95% of players will likely stop. There's also 700 gear score in terms of optimizing that might be worth getting into. This consists of artifacts. Some artifacts drop from kind of various spots. I'd recommend kind of finding 1 or 2 that you're looking to get, and then kind of finding the areas in which they drop and pursuing them. The most noteworthy thing about these is the mutated expeditions do drop the artifacts. It is after you do 5, you're supposed to be guaranteed to get the artifacts. So just make sure that you do your 5 for that mutation if you want to get the artifact, and that will kind of speed your progress up a lot. And then moving on from the 700 gear score, we have the end game area, which is the raids or the PvP island. And then finally, I think the kind of post end game is more the economy aspect, trying to see how big of a number you can get for here, and then leveraging that number to do whatever you want to do in your means, whether it be to declare war, try to get territory, whether it be to acquire better and better gear, acquire more and more sets. It really, that kind of allows you to progress a lot faster the more gold you have. With that being said, let me know if you guys have any questions. For veteran players, please put tips in the comment section below for anything that's super major that I missed. And for newer players, good luck, and I hope you guys enjoy it, because the leveling experience and kind of the getting to the end game is probably the most fun part about this game in general, and I think it's kind of underappreciated. And I'll see you guys in the next video.